Welcome to Navigators, a MedBridge podcast where we conquer challenging topics in neurologic and geriatric rehabilitation. Our aim is to deliver actionable takeaways for physical and occupational therapy providers like you through captivating discussions with influential practitioners in our field. To receive continuing education credit for this episode and access bonus resources, make sure to check out medbridge.com. Hello, I'm your host, Mowder-Tinney, a physical therapist with over 30 years of experience working with people with neurologic deficits, as well as the aging adult population. I have multiple certifications, including being a board-certified clinical specialist in neurologic physical therapy and a certified exercise expert for aging adults. Today, I'm excited to be joined by Darcy Reisman, professor and chairperson of the Department of Physical Therapy at the University of Delaware. Dr. Reisman is an expert in all aspects of improving the lives of people post-stroke, with a particular focus on getting them walking again. She's a true knowledge translator, bridging the gap between research and clinical practice. And today we'll be diving deeper into post-stroke rehab, discussing her recent research and sharing actionable takeaways that you can implement right away. Welcome, Darcy.
Hi, JJ.
I have to admit, I'm feeling a bit starstruck because you are truly one of the researchers I admire most. So I am beyond thrilled to be here with you today. So for our listeners who may not know as much about you, could you start us off by sharing a bit about your background?
Yeah, thanks, JJ. It's so great to be here with you. I feel like you and I probably have known each other like 20 years now. I hate to say that it's been that long, but I think it has. So it's great to be here. So my background is as a physical therapist. I graduated from PT school in the early 90s, and I practiced in neuro rehab and acute rehab for about 6 years. Went to the University of Delaware to get my PhD. And I really started out looking at recovery of upper extremity control in folks with neurologic conditions. And then in my postdoctoral training at Johns Hopkins Kennedy Krieger Institute, really transitioned into looking at walking, particularly in people with stroke. And that's really been my passion ever since. All of my work focuses on primarily people after stroke, and really from more basic work, trying to understand principles of motor learning that we can apply to walking through, running clinical trials and testing interventions in people post-stroke. And most of my research has been in people living with chronic stroke.
So that's amazing. So much background. But can you tell us a little bit more about what initially attracted you to investigating walking recovery after stroke and kind of how that passion evolved?
Yeah. So I think that for me as a physical therapist, I felt like I was sort of, when I was practicing, we were getting people like a certain amount better. But when it came to mobility, they still felt very limited, and they still made a lot of choices in their everyday life based around their mobility and what they thought they were able to physically do. And I just was not very satisfied with that as a researcher. I really wanted people to be able to live the fullest lives, however full they wanted it to be as far as mobility went. And so it just felt, I really enjoyed studying, the upper extremity. But for me, that recovery of walking really felt like what really changed people's lives the most in terms of what they were able to do living with stroke. So I think that's really a lot of what drove my passion, was really the functional side of things.
And on that point, I just love that so much. And I love watching you at CSM and listening to you talk and listening to your research. And it was actually CSM this last year where I was like, oh my gosh, do you think I could get Darcy to come on? Because you were talking about walking capacity versus walking performance after stroke, and just how important that difference is in their recovery. And I was like, it's not like I didn't think about it, but I didn't think about it the way that you laid it out.
Yeah.
So I was wondering if you could talk more about that component, even before we get into the specifics and how clinicians can be thinking about that.
Yeah. So I think this is something that we have really has really started to kind of coalesce in the research, both for walking, but also for the upper extremity. That after stroke, there seems to be a disconnect between people's capacity for doing something and then what they actually, I like to say, do, right, in the real world. So we see this in Catherine Lang's upper extremity work, and then we see it in our locomotion work, where capacity is what you measure in a structured environment, like a clinic or a research lab. It's the 6-minute walk test. How far can they go? It's the 10-meter walk test. How fast can they go? And that gives you an idea of what someone is physically capable. That's where that capacity term comes from. And then there's this other piece, which is, what do they actually do in an unstructured environment, in their home, in their community? And I will tell you that for the longest time, I really was sort of operating as a researcher under the idea that if I built their capacity, performance would naturally come, right? So that the issue with folks not walking after stroke wasn't a performance issue, it was a capacity issue, right? They didn't have the endurance, they didn't have the speed. And we were doing some research, really working on trying to improve some of those capacity measures. And it was around the time people were starting to think about step monitors. And so I put a research grade step monitor on folks. And I was doing it actually for a really interesting reason. I also study motor learning. And we know in motor learning, one of the biggest drivers is repetition. And because this research study was working on capacity and trying to build actually their a biomechanical feature that was going to translate into faster walking, I wanted to see how much they were practicing at home. And I was absolutely shocked at how much capacity people were gaining and how little performance they were gaining, right? Mm-hmm. So their 6-minute walk test was doubling. Their walking speed was doubling. And they were not changing what they were doing at home at all. And as a physical therapist, that was actually devastating to me, right? Because it's like, well, the whole point is to change their everyday life, right? Not to like just get them
right in heart,
right? It's not like in a way, who cares what they could do in the clinic when I'm testing them, right? So that was about 15, 18 years ago now. And that really just launched this whole line of investigation for me of trying to really understand why someone's capacity would change and their performance wouldn't. Because I think if you think about it from the standpoint of like an athlete, right? If an athlete is, VO2 max goes up, they do better in their race, right? There isn't necessarily this big disconnect. And so, I really kind of started down a path of really trying to understand that disconnect, because to me, that was really the ultimate goal for our patients, is to change their everyday life and their everyday behavior, not, the things that we measure in the clinic. Not that those aren't important, right? But they need both.
Yeah, and that whole quality of life piece that we're so focused on, and I can see where your heart must have been like, what is happening? Because you would think it would just make sense to cross over just like the athletes. And we get a lot of our ideas originally from how do people learn in general and how do people get motivated and those types of things. So that's really fascinating to me. And when you're looking at your research or what the research is saying, like, can you give us some highlights, like the important takeaways?
Yeah. So the important takeaway of this study that we published last year, it's the result of a 4-site clinical trial where we were trying to look at interventions that we specifically thought were important for not only building capacity, but also building performance. So in the 15 years or so intervening, my first aha moment of, oh my goodness, we're building capacity and not changing performance. We started to really look into other patient populations and try to understand this. And it turns out, this is not unique to people with stroke. And that often when you're really trying to change everyday performance when it comes to walking, you're really thinking about sometimes people needing a behavioral intervention because really you're asking them to change their behavior. And so we really wanted to understand not only building capacity, but also building performance. So we did a 3-arm clinical trial One arm was a step activity monitoring behavioral intervention where we were specifically just focused on improving steps per day outside of the clinical setting. We did a capacity building intervention, and that was high intensity walking, both on the treadmill and over ground. And then we did a combined intervention. And our hypothesis was that the combined intervention would have the greatest the people who were in the combined intervention would have the greatest improvement in their steps per day, because our hypothesis was we needed to build both their capacity and we needed to teach them how to take that capacity into their everyday life, because our previous work had identified they weren't naturally doing that. Mm-hmm. And so the behavioral intervention included 3 key ingredients that have been shown in other patient populations to be important. That's monitoring how much people are walking. So we use the Fitbit, but you could use other devices. It also includes setting goals. So they have to set goals for how many steps that they want to take. And it included sort of a motivational interviewing type techniques, a coaching strategy, if you will, helping people identify barriers and facilitators to being more active in their everyday life. The capacity building intervention was the high intensity walking intervention that many of you are familiar with, trying to train 70 to 80% of heart rate reserve, both on the treadmill and over ground. And then the combined intervention was just the 2 of them together. And what we found was that, it sounds so silly now, but we had to demonstrate it. If you want to build capacity, you should do a capacity building intervention like high intensity walking training. If you want to improve performance, you need to have a behavioral intervention that helps people understand how to improve their walking in their everyday life. And it sounds so silly now, but really has not been shown before. So that's what we showed. So ultimately, if you really want people to be more active in their everyday life, you have to incorporate some of this behavioral intervention into what you're doing in therapy that really helps them figure out how to be more active.
And well, you're right. I guess when you say it like the way you did, you're saying, oh, well, that's really obvious, but it really wasn't. And that's not, again, the assumption that was being made, the importance of not doing that, but the assumption made sense to us in regards to we're getting them better here and we're seeing them go faster, right, and we know the benefit of this intervention. But it's just so important that we not lose sight of that big picture. And just, I wanted to, I found the other day, and you must have known it was there, but the whole motivational interviewing thing I found on the neuropt.org website. So hopefully we can put in the show notes that there's a motivational interviewing cheat sheet that they, I don't know how long that's been there. I don't know how I came across it. I was just searching some things and I was like, they have so many great things on that website. Those task forces just rock it. And so, but that was a new one. I swear you could go in that website and tool around forever. So if the motivational interviewing, because I know this talk isn't exactly about that, I think maybe you can give us some tips when we go a little further into your research. But before I forget, I just want to throw out there that they have this really nice reference component for that. And then I want to talk more about step activity monitoring. But when you looked at this research and you're thinking about, because your knowledge translation focus is just so near and dear to my heart, that you're looking specifically at people post-stroke. Are you looking at what kind of patient conditions are we thinking of here?
Yeah, I should have mentioned that. Sorry, JJ.
No.
Yeah, it's all of my work pretty much at this point is in people living with chronic stroke. So more than 6 months post-stroke. And again, I think when you think about what we saw, it's actually even more exciting, right? So we had people, up to 10 years post-stroke who are making these really big changes. And so I think it really goes to show that, there isn't a ceiling on this kind of recovery after stroke. We happen to not be dealing with people in the subacute-ish phase pre 6 months. We're only dealing with people after 6 months stroke.
But so I recognize that, and being able to access people and being able to find the right fit. But just think this information, though, the sooner we start, the better. When you can see a change in someone who's 10 years post and has a lot of habits that are hard to break, but, but take some of this information, I could see just kind of tooling around in some of our acute inpatient or inpatient rehab, brains, or even just, just getting excited, even in acute care, of the goal part. Like you mentioned something earlier about the patient had to write a goal or determine a goal. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah. So I will say, I'm being a classic scientist, I try not to extrapolate beyond the work that I've done.
Yes,
but I do think that this sort of principle of, if you want people's everyday life to change, needing to help them through using behavior change techniques, I don't see why that would be unique to someone living with chronic stroke as opposed to, someone who's 3 months post-stroke, right? I can't say that from my data, but it does seem like that's a reasonable principle to apply. Yeah, there's 3 components to the step activity monitoring program. One is monitoring what you're doing, right? Because I think we all tend to think we're walking more, we're doing more than we actually are. So any kind of device that the person wants to use, and we can talk a little bit more about that. There is an issue in people with stroke because they do walk slower. So some devices are not as good at picking up that really slow walking. The second thing is goal setting. That, people have to set a goal, and the approach when you're using a motivational interviewing type approach, you're acting as a coach. So instead of us giving the person the goal, we're helping the person decide on the goal that they want to achieve, right? Because the whole point of this is trying to empower them to be able to do this when we're not there. So we're helping them figure out what goal they want to set based on so that, they're wearing the device, they wear it for a week. We figure out sort of what their baseline walking is. Then we're helping them figure out what they want their goal to be. And then we're using motivational interviewing type techniques. So helping build self-efficacy, rolling with resistance, some of those classic motivational interviewing type ideas, and using that theory in our conversations with our patients, particularly in helping them identify barriers and facilitators of their walking. And again, we can talk about this more later, but those are the 3 key components to the program.
Okay. And that goal, is that you're just setting it after you're setting one goal after the week in your research?
It's a great question. So our goal was every 4 to 6, the therapist's goal was to get their step goal to increase every 4 to 6 sessions.
Okay.
So what they would initially set a goal, and we would try to, if they were hitting that goal, we would try to increase it every 4 to 6 sessions, again, in conjunction with them. And a lot of what that goal setting, when I say in conjunction with them, it's hard sometimes for them to calibrate. Maybe they've heard in the popular media, it's 10,000 steps per day. They're walking 1,500 steps per day. They're like, I need to get to 10,000. And we're saying, that would be fantastic, but let's think about what you might be able to do in the next 4 to 6 sessions, right? And so really, we're not telling them, no, you can't set a 10,000 step goal, but we're just really trying to help guide them to something that we think would be realistic for them to be relatively consistently hitting after 4 to 6 sessions.
It was a little creepy because it was like you're reading my mind, because I was just thinking that's kind of abstract. Like, okay, so what does 1,500 feet steps mean? Is there anything, this kind of sidebar, but is there anything out there that this would be like walking around the block, or this would be like walking around the grocery store, or going out on an errand, where you have kind of steps that are associated with something that's more concrete and realistic for a person?
Yeah. So some of our earlier work was really trying to understand sort of what's a short walking bout, what's a medium walking bout, what's a long walking bout. And one of the things that people are really surprised about is that most of us are doing walking bouts. Most of our walking bouts in our everyday lives, if we're working, are around 25 to 50 steps. Someone knocks on your office door, you get up, you answer the door, you sit back down, right? Think about you're in your kitchen, right? You're walking around your kitchen. In working people, the majority of the longer walking bouts, like a typical office worker type person, right? The majority of our longer walking bouts have to do with like getting to and from our house to our car, from our office to our car, right? Walking into a grocery store. Those tend to be our longer walking bouts that occur outside of purposeful exercise, right? So there's a whole nother category, which is like, I'm going to go walk in the park, right? But the type of walking that we do in our everyday life that's outside of purposeful walking, if you think about parking lot to office building, parking lot to Costco, to getting in the doors of Costco, those tend to be your longer walking bouts. Your short walking bouts tend to be around your kitchen, around your house. And then your medium walking bouts tend to be things like walking to the end of the driveway to get your mail, bringing your garbage cans to the street, from your garage or whatever. Those tend to be more of your medium walking bouts. And we try to kind of give people those kind of examples. The other thing that we do talk to people a lot about is they're going to have the monitor on so they can start to figure out for their own lives, what does it look like? If I'm going to walk to my mailbox, how many steps is that? If I'm going to do X, Y, and Z, how many steps is that? And so what we try to talk to them about is, they say, so we have them do that. And they say, okay, well, to and from my mailbox is 100 steps. And, and we say, all right, well, if you did that once a day to get your mail, but then you did it an additional couple times, right? You've just tripled your steps.
Right.
Super easy, tripled your steps, right? So I think that is kind of what you were getting at, JJ. How do we help them understand what 100 steps looks like and how they could change that and how they could add to that in a meaningful way? And then as they start to get the hang of it, honestly, their goal setting gets more and more realistic. It's really those initial couple goals that are tough.
Okay. So I just want to recap this because I think this is so important. The more specific we can be and highlight that whole, I love the way you said it. Okay, but if you just walk down and back, 2 more times, you tripled your steps. And that sounds impactful, which it is. But I mean, it just in the way you're presenting this, but to make it real, to make it not just, okay, I'm going to walk 50 more steps today. Like, what does that mean to you? Well, now, what if you took your dog around the house? How far is that? Like, it seems like, of course, I always picture a chart because I'm a chart girl. But I mean, if therapists could have, just a rough idea of the key things that you used to be in charge of when, before the stroke, what I was in charge of the trash, I was in charge of laundry, I was in charge of walking the dog or whatever, and then putting some of those tasks there. I'm just seeing that buy-in. I'm seeing that visual. And even from a therapist standpoint, like now I want to know, I want a big whole chart of, average. I know it's different for everybody, but I just think when you can get more specific, then it makes so much more sense to both the therapist and the patient. And then you have better buy-in. So I just love that you guys were all over that.
Yeah. And so I think, JJ, to your point, one of the things that we talk about, the reason we sort of group it into like short, medium, and long bouts is we tell people the majority of humans walking is in these short bouts, right? The long bouts that we take, that's not, 50 times a day that we're walking into Target and walking out, or that we're doing that kind of thing typically once a day at most, right? To try to help people understand, like just in your everyday life, there's so many opportunities to really, really change your daily stepping. I think people get really overwhelmed when therapists say, you need to walk more. And they're immediately thinking, I need to go walk to the park. I need to go do all this like stuff that's very overwhelming. Instead, I like to say things to people like, so-and-so will say, my wife does all I'm going to be very stereotypical, but we do hear this a lot. If it's a male stroke patient, they'll say, my wife does this, because we talk to them exactly like what you just said. We talk to them about what did you do pre-stroke that you're not doing now? So exactly what you said. That's exactly how we talk about it. And they'll say, well, I never did the shopping. My wife did the shopping. And we'll be like, yeah, but if you just went shopping with her, like you'd hit your goal. If that's all you added to your day, you'd hit your goal. And all of a sudden it's like, oh, well, I can do that. Like that's easy peasy. I don't have to be thinking about this all day long, right? So I think, again, to your point, we're really that this whole idea of using motivational interviewing type techniques is to connect with the person on something that makes sense for their daily life. And I think as therapists, we're really naturally good at this. But we just want to be a little bit more intentional, I think, when we're thinking about these behavioral interventions.
And I agree. I agree. Oh, so exciting. But because it's about being realistic. And just on your point, I think therapists are great at this, but I also think therapists tend to be hard on themselves. And if they can't do the whole intervention, then they feel like they can't do that intervention. And there's a sliding scale. And I think when we get to more specifics and think of instead of general, we take that same approach with the patients. I think that can be extremely beneficial. And it was just, I didn't realize that you had gone into that much detail, and it totally makes sense knowing you, Darcy. But that's very exciting to me, because I just think that can be so helpful. And again, even just saying motivational interview, to a therapist, you should do some motivational interviewing. It's like, whoa, Nellie, like, what is all that going to entail? And how much time is that going to take? But when you can start giving some specifics of what is your overarching goal to improve this patient's quality of life. And so how can I have these little specific components that I can start like weaving into what we're doing automatically? And this literature is just, building, granted, not, with all different types of populations yet, but there's other research to support the motivational interviewing, It's all the pieces are kind of coming together. And so that's just very exciting.
Yeah, you'll notice I use the term motivational interviewing type techniques. And I do that very purposely, because we did not train our therapists. So motivational interviewing, of course, if you're a neuropsychologist, they're trained they do a lot of training to become certified as a motivational interviewer. We did not do that. That is not realistic for most physical therapists to do that. So we take the principles of motivational interviewing and we apply them in this specific context. And so you don't need to be overwhelmed by it, because as a therapist, for example, one of my favorite, motivational interviewing principles is building self-efficacy. As therapists, we know all about helping people build self-efficacy, right? Now we have to think about specifically how we would do that in this context. But simply helping people, providing data to people that they're achieving their goals is building self-efficacy, right?
Absolutely.
So just reviewing their monitoring over the last couple of days since you've seen them and saying to them, look, you hit your goal, that's building their self-efficacy, right? These are not things that have to take a lot of time. We all talk to our patients while we're doing things with them. And instead of talking always about their grandkids or this or that, you can simply be talking about some of these things, right? And brainstorming some of these things. So it's not like people will say, oh, well, how much time does this take? I don't think I have time to do this. And I say, really, the only thing you have to really carve out time for is to take a minute to look at what they did in terms of steps since the last time you saw them, and see how that aligns with their goals. All the other motivational interviewing stuff that we're talking about, where you were saying, asking them, well, what were you responsible before you did your stroke, right? That can all happen while you're walking over to X piece of equipment, or while they're taking a break from doing something else or whatever.
This is all low-hanging fruit. And I think you're right. It's not that we don't know these things. It's that we need to be more explicit about it. And, we're thinking it in our heads, thinking it's obvious to them that they did better, as opposed to, oh my gosh, like, you really did rock it out. You even did more than you set with your goal, and then giving them the autonomy to choose, the next, you're just like layering in one over the other concepts that can really help them see this is attainable, and I'm making this goal, and now I'm reaching this one. And even, I just think that's so exciting. Obviously it doesn't take much, but I feel like it's so doable, and people already know a lot of pieces. It's just they sometimes just need a little bit of help of the more specifics of how to make that, to set that up more specifically. And I think that's incredibly helpful. And I just have to say, motivational interviewing type techniques. Is that what you said?
Yes,
Okay.
exactly.
I'm not very good. I tend to use my phrases, so I need you to make sure that I'm saying that okay. But that makes it even better. That just goes along with the all or nothing. So no, we don't need to do all or nothing. We can have types in there. So that makes me happy.
And that was a very conscious decision, obviously, in the design of the intervention, right? I mean, if I can have the greatest intervention in the world, and if it requires someone to go get a special certification, what's the real reality of that being used in the clinic? Very low. Yeah.
Well, and okay, since you've gone here, now I want to take this opportunity. So your intervention that had the best outcomes for performance, meaning quality of life at home, was this whole component that we were just talking about, but also the high intensity component within the session.
Yep.
And so one of the biggest things, this is anecdotal, this is my perception of talking to therapists from all over, is what I try to push is like the continuous heart rate monitoring is this objective piece of information that can give you so much insight into, oh, this activity doesn't really do it for them, but this one does, but this one doesn't, but this one does, or, and trying to figure out the best fit for your patient. But just that aspect can feel overwhelming because of equipment or and I'm like, just start with something small. And I'm curious, just from your experience.
Yeah.
And from your research, I mean, like for the average bare clinician, like what types of things have been realistically implemented from a continuous heart rate monitoring? Because again, that's my opinion, is that if we're just trying to start somewhere, that I think can really give them the visual and insight is that.
Yeah. So I would say that the gold standard that we use in research is a strap heart rate monitor that's actually measuring, the heart rate. That is more or less realistic depending on your situation, right? In terms of, I know, for example, in our clinic downstairs where we're trying to implement this, sometimes putting that strap on involves getting the person behind a curtain, and it adds 10 minutes to a session. So instead of doing that, we'll put, the oxygen consumption monitor that's really, meant for measuring oxygen consumption, but we'll put it on their finger and it gives us a good enough heart rate, right? So that we can get a heart rate easily while we're doing something. People have devices that they own, right? That they wear on their wrists that give them a good enough heart rate. Now, if someone had a really significant cardiac condition where you were really concerned, obviously the more accurate heart rate monitor you can get, the better. But for most of our folks, it does not need to be the fancy heart strap monitor, right? It could be these more easily accessible external devices. I mean, it's so easy to pop one of those on somebody's fingertip, or, to pop the watch on somebody's wrist. So I think those, the oxygen consumption monitor and the wrist monitor are the two that I've seen probably be easiest for people to use quickly in the clinic.
Yeah, and I know there's forearm and then there's biceps and different companies, and they go through apps on people's phones. I know, because wherever I go, whenever I'm asking people, I'm like, so what are you doing? Like, what are you doing? And that even the ones that are doing really high intensive pieces, components consistently are like, it's a challenge. But I'm like, but I like the watch if they already had a watch, or a watch is something they could go home with. So they could be accurate within themselves if we could teach them earlier on to do the steps and the heart rate and align it with the rate RPE. I'm assuming you're incorporating that piece as like trying to triple your information. Or
so what I always tell therapists about the high intensity piece, especially people who feel like it's not necessarily skilled PT. And if you've really tried to do it, it's incredibly, you have to be incredibly skillful, because as you said, you're trying to understand and help educate the person in what activities actually get their heart rate up into appropriate zone. And you as the therapist are using all of your skills to to watch the participant and understand and triangulate the data you're getting. So you're using the heart rate monitor, you're getting RPE, you're looking for signs and symptoms of exertion. You're doing all of that. And I teach in our DPT program, and I tell the students all the time, the heart rate monitor is an objective piece of information, and it's one piece of information.
Yeah.
So if somebody, because people get very hung up on the beta blocker issue, right? And that heart rate's I said, even the beta blocker, yes, it's going to blunt their maximum heart rate, but in many cases, you're looking for a change in heart rate that matches their RPE, that matches the other signs and symptoms, right? That you as a therapist are taking in all that information and making your clinical assessment, right? So even if the heart rate, they're on a beta blocker, the heart rate only changes by 15 beats per minute because it's getting blunted by the beta blocker, but the person is telling you they're 16 RPE, they're sweating, they're exerting themselves, they're having difficulty holding a conversation with you, right? You put that all together and you're okay, I'm good. I'm in the zone I want to be in, right? So I think that's where the skill comes in for a lot of this, right? Is really putting this together. And I think, we're talking about walking here, right? But there's a lot of activities you can do with patients that get their heart rate up that aren't just walking. I think people tend to get kind of stuck on the walking piece. And I do love the walking piece because I think it is a goal for a lot of patients. And you're hitting that task specificity along with the intensity. So you're hitting two of those principles of neuroplasticity. So I do like it. But there's a lot of, let's just say the person's not safe walking at home. You can get their heart rate up with sit to stand, I guarantee you.
Absolutely.
So to your point, again, it's using all of that information to make your decisions about whether you're hitting the intensity goals, not just relying on one piece of information.
And not only for us using all that information, but then what we find from that information, using our skilled clinical reasoning to teach them.
Yep.
When you're a sweaty face guy, that's okay. If you're following that RPE and you're a sweaty face guy, good. But if you get to here and now you're feeling this, then now let's do a standing break, or now maybe it is time to sit down. But if we're scared to push them, I always say, then they're scared to push themselves. And the only people who are going to help them feel more confident in doing that is us teaching them. So learning together, just saying, oh, I'm going to put these three things together. This information is going to help me figure this out. And then we're going to figure it out because we're going to figure it out together.
Yeah.
I think we can look at it as being frustrated of, I don't know what the right thing to do is. I think therapists are just so hard on themselves about that. Or, oh, this is an opportunity to gather information and share information so you feel more empowered when you go home to do these activities and find ones that actually do raise your heart rate, but are safe, but you can do safely from the couch a bunch of times every time before you get up to go eat or whatever.
Yeah.
So I look at it as a puzzle. I think that's very exciting. And I think you're just these components that you brought up, it's just so incredibly helpful. And I'm wondering, and you kind of talked about this because we talked about so much, but talking points or word choices or strategies, for the buy-in and the carryover. I mean, I feel like we've talked about that. Is there anything else you'd want to add to that?
Are you talking about for the high intensity piece or for increasing steps per day, outside of the clinic?
Yes.
All of it.
I mean, whatever you just would really like to highlight to the therapist is what I really want to get to.
Yeah. So I think one of the things that I really like to talk to patients about the fact that they're an athlete, that the principles that athletes use are the same principles that we're using here, right? We all know that if you want to get faster, you want to be able to go longer, etc., that's what you have to practice, right? And athletes know that, and it's no different. It's no different after a stroke. But the really exciting thing that we have going for us after a stroke is that not only does the cardiovascular system, the cardiopulmonary system, the muscular system, not only do those principles apply to those systems, but they apply to their brain.
Yeah, it's very
They
fun.
can be changing their brain with these interventions, with these things that they're doing. And if they think of themselves as an athlete that's also getting their brain to change, right? Because that's the thing that got damaged, was their brain. If they can think about it that way, and they can think about what an athlete has to do, they're an athlete. And I think taking it, for me, for a lot of patients, taking it out of like the medical realm, because we are asking them for actually to make lifelong changes now, right? That are going to far exceed the medical interventions that they get relative to their stroke. They're not going to be getting, maybe other than blood pressure regulation or whatever, they're not going to be getting quote unquote treatment for their stroke for their entire life. But we need them to be doing these things their entire life, right? So I think if we can take some of our conversations out of the medical realm and help them see themselves not as a patient, but as an athlete, or as, if they don't identify with that, talking to them about, just how for their overall health. I think when you talk to patients about rehab as if it's going to end, I mean, honestly, you and I don't stay in shape if we stop exercising.
Right.
And just because you've had a stroke, it's not different, right? If you stop doing things, you're going to backslide. And so what I try to explain to patients is I'm trying to help you figure out how to make this an everyday part of your life, right? And that's where I think the behavioral monitoring piece can be so important. I think people get very overwhelmed by thinking that they need to exercise, right? Yeah. But if you can explain to them, look, we all have ups and downs in our lives. There are times when I'm really good about 5 times a week exercise, and there are months at a time where I'm not. And so when I can't be doing that, I'm focusing on my everyday life and how I can make sure I'm staying active through my everyday activities, because that's better than nothing, right?
Yeah.
So I think, again, taking it a little bit out of the medical realm is helpful.
And I love that too. Plus it overlaps. I mean, when you think about athletes of that whole, once the swimmer hits the wall, the first thing they do is, what's my time? What time did I get? And that whole piece of, we need to continue to give them something objective, because I always kind of mention, like, if a person isn't how they were before the stroke, they don't see the improvements. To them, improving is the way I was before, where we need to really showcase those, and we have to be explicit about that. So I just think that's really exciting. So, okay, so maximum impact here, when we're talking about your top 3 actionable takeaways for clinicians to put into practice, what would you say?
If you want to improve performance, which is activity outside of a structured setting, you need to be focusing on a behavior change intervention that incorporates activities that they do in their everyday life. In order to build people's capacity for doing activity, you need to focus on things that build their capacity, things that push their endurance, things that push their speed, like high intensity training. And the final thing that I would say is the patient has to be an active participant in the decision making and in the goal setting if there's going to be any long-term benefit.
Well said. Well said. So, all right, we have time for a case. So can you apply this, talking a couple hypothetical or a hypothetical case scenario? Yep. Can you kind of put that together for us all? Walk us through it.
So think about, 58-year-old female, status post ischemic stroke. 3 years ago, I'm putting this in the realm of chronic stroke since that's where most of our literature is. Left hemiparesis, mild expressive aphasia. Person's able to walk unassisted with a single point cane. Gait speed, you measure it on the 10-meter walk test, you get 0.45 meters per second. So, that puts the person in a fairly lower functional category from a walking standpoint. Distance on the 6-meter walk is 181 meters. That's, someone who has pretty low endurance. Functional gait assessment score is 17. Person has problems walking over obstacles, walking backwards, walking with eyes closed, and walking with a narrow base of support, kind of giving you the clue that, on level surfaces, in sort of unconstrained environments, they do well, maybe more difficult with what we would consider more functional walking opportunities. The patient's goal is to be able to walk farther without needing to sit down so she can walk around the neighborhood with her husband after dinner. So the first question, that I would kind of ask people to think about in that scenario is, if she wants to be able to walk farther, do we need to be thinking about capacity, performance, or both? And I would argue that because her distance on her 6-minute walk test is so low, and because her gait speed is so slow, that this person needs some capacity building, right? They're not going to just be able to have a behavioral intervention probably and meet their goal. And because their goal is so functional, they want to be able to walk with their husband and not take these breaks. As you're building their capacity, if you're not also talking to her about how she's taking that newfound capacity and doing more every day, you're going to stop therapy. She's going to be at 280 meters on her 6-minute walk, and she's not going to know, won't necessarily have met her goal with her husband, right? Because you've got to help her figure out how she's doing that. So for example, I tell people all the time, there's those little, if they don't have a rollator that has a seat, I tell them there's little tiny folding chairs that, your husband could carry, right? And your goal is, all right, this week you made it to X point before you had to sit. All right, what's realistic, right? So now, you want to be able to go, to the next tree, which is, roughly 100 feet or whatever. All right, let's talk about how many steps is that? So you can start to help them really figure out how to take the capacity building into their everyday function to achieve their behavioral goal.
I love that. And just the working together part, like, so, well, if, and making sure you understand, I don't want to sit down, people look at me, well, just sit down and enjoy them, like wave to the cars as they drive by and just kind of integrate. I love that idea. I never thought of asking them to just carry a little lightweight chair.
We hear this a lot when you start talking to people about improving their steps per day. They get very nervous about not being able to make it back or whatever. And so we just try to take that barrier out. And also letting them know that, eventually you're not going to have to carry the chair.
Right.
But I always tell people, I can run a 5K, but I can't run a marathon. And I'm not going to get to being able to run a marathon unless I build up. And it's no different for them.
Right. But I'm just sitting here going, well, I didn't ever think of that. But I do that a lot. So that's just very exciting. Thanks for that.
I think therapists are great at giving each other ideas, right?
It's my favorite thing. It's my favorite thing. So I'm very lucky to have you here doing that. And I think that that whole concept of big picture now, just to reinforce on this case, that you did the whole motivational interviewing type technique. What for your intervention would you have chosen to do?
Yeah. So at this point in time, I am really usually using high intensity walking training. Whether it be, we have a study going on right now with Pierce Boyne. He's the PI. It's a 3-site clinical trial building on our high intensity interval training preliminary efficacy and feasibility study that we did, where we saw the high intensity interval training led to larger changes in 6-minute walk. If I thought the person was appropriate for interval training, I would do that. Otherwise, I would do traditional high intensity training. I like to incorporate, when someone has a behavioral component to their goal, like walking outside with their husband, I like to understand from them, what are the kind of surfaces they're encountering? What are things that might be barriers to them? And then in the overground portion, I like to build that in. So obviously this person's wanting to walk outside. So I want to build in some uneven surfaces. I want to build in, up and down a curb or whatever. So I try to not just stay on the treadmill, but I really try to always, regardless of the person's goal, honestly, because everybody needs to walk, on level surface and not on a treadmill. I try to incorporate the high intensity walking with some of these really functional walking activities. And that would be probably what I would do for my capacity building piece. If I felt like there were particular challenges with, like in this case, this person's gait speed is pretty slow, that's where I would tend to the high intensity interval piece, because I can get them walking really fast. And they can do that for that like little short interval, because we know that propulsion, that push off force is what really generates faster walking speed. And we know that when you're doing those really high, fast walking speeds, that they're getting a lot of that propulsion for practice for free.
Yeah.
And so that's why I would go to the interval training for that person if I could.
Beautiful. Yeah, I absolutely think that interval training is so key for our patients to be successful. So maybe we just might have to have you back to talk about that other study that included high intensity interval training, because, just in regards to, I loved your rationale of, because you don't have to give cueing. It's not any of this verbal cueing, and, whether you add resistance or weighted vest or however, and then go as hard as they can for the time. Or if you hear yourself say their muscles will fatigue and they can't last very long, well, that's, then that would lead me down this pathway versus this pathway. So I love those types of conversations with the key researchers. So, okay, wrap things up because we're almost out of time. What final words of wisdom or inspiration would you like to leave with the audience?
I think that therapists don't give themselves enough credit for everything they can get done in a session with a patient. I think it's easier than you think to incorporate some of these behavioral things into the session that you already have built to work on some of the physical things. And you need to give yourself credit for being really skillful at that. And it does take a little bit of practice and a little planning, but you absolutely can do it. And I would also say that you and your patients are a team. You and your patient are a team, and that working together and identifying goals together is going to lead to the greatest buy-in. You don't have to have all the answers. As you said earlier, JJ, you can work together with the patient to uncover what's going to work best for them. And I think not feeling like you have to have all the answers all the time can be really empowering.
Oh, my heart. Yes, I wholeheartedly agree. Oh, Darcy, well, that's all the time we have for today, I'm sad to say. But a huge thank you to Darcy for sharing her expertise and dedication to improving post-stroke walking recovery. Your passion, obviously, for optimizing outcomes through research truly shines through, and I'm sure we'll all have some valuable clinical takeaways to apply in our own practice. So thanks again, Darcy, for your commitment to helping individuals regain their mobility and quality of life after stroke. I really appreciate you coming on.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure, JJ.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Neuro Navigators by MedBridge. Please be sure to subscribe and listen to more of our episodes on Spotify or your favorite podcast platform and at medbridge.com. If you're listening outside of the MedBridge catalog and would like to access the bonus resources and receive continuing education credit, simply log into your MedBridge account and search for this episode to find the accreditation details. Neuro Navigators also listens to you. If there's a particular clinician that you'd like to hear from, or if you have a clinical question or challenge that you'd like to see addressed on this podcast, please let us know by leaving a comment on our Instagram posts or by emailing podcasts@medbridge.com. As we wrap up today, remember that your dedication makes a difference. We appreciate you being here to navigate these topics and hope you enjoyed our deep dive into everything neuro. See you next time.